Welcome back, critical thinkers. Today we're going to be talking about morals, values, and ethics. And of course, this is all surrounding our running theme for the class, which is how to ask and answer questions about the world and how do we figure out what's true. And of course, last time we talked about different kinds of issues, different kinds of questions. And one of the things we covered were value issues, right? We covered the idea that you can ask a question about good or bad, right or wrong. And so, of course, those kinds of issues are going to be informed by our values. So make sure you have the PowerPoint lecture outline. Again, it's available as a PDF, but it's the exact same content, the exact same material. Make sure you have those notes available to you so that you can take notes as we have our online discussion. And once again, there is a forum for this particular discussion, this particular lecture, entitled Values and Ethics. So if you have any questions about anything we covered today, please feel free to put your questions there so that your what I'm sure will be excellent questions can benefit everyone. All right, so I have values and ethics, and the very first slide is just a joke about from Calvin and Hobbes, because Calvin is not particularly ethical, doesn't have a strong moral compass, as they say. So moving on to the substantive portion, right, is slide 2. And so this is just sort of an overview of what today is going to be like. We're going to be basically first talking about assumptions. And what people's value assumptions are. Then we're going to talk about value conflict. We're going to talk about value prioritization. We're going to talk about ideal versus real values, which really, they're quite different. People's ideals, what would happen in a perfect world, is different from what you can actually accomplish in the real world. Right? All right, and then we'll talk about ethics and argumentation. So slide 3, this idea about assumptions. So I think the first thing that a critical thinker has to be aware of is oftentimes we have sort of unconscious beliefs about the way the world ought to be. Because what are values? Values are things we think are good or bad, right or wrong, right? They're these core ideals that we hold close to ourselves and say, I value honesty, I value integrity, I value truth and justice in the American way, or, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. No, not really. But what I mean by value assumptions is that often our values are unstated. They're unconscious. We have a general sense or a knee-jerk gut-level reaction to various questions, good or bad, right or wrong, but they're often completely unstated. They're often unstated to ourselves. They're things we assume are good or bad, right or wrong, without actually carefully reflecting on them. And different people have different value structures, and I think two people of perfectly good will can sometimes disagree on value-related questions, but we can't sort of ask and answer a question that's value-related, a value issue, if we don't even know what our values are, if we haven't even explicitly stated and looked at our values and go, okay, what do I actually believe is good or bad, right or wrong? So to be aware, a good critical thinker pushes back against their assumptions and asks these questions explicitly, as opposed to just having knee-jerk reactions that they don't carefully examine. And so moving on to slide 4, what are then values? What are some basic definitions of values? Well, the values, as defined in this class, are your beliefs, your attitudes, your ideals, those core concepts, those big ideas. Values are those big ideas that you think are important, that you think are worthwhile to pursue in the world and in your behavior. So things like truth, to value truth, to say that truth is an important value, or to be loyal. Loyalty as an important value, that you think this big idea is an important one. Or freedom. So as you can sort of see, values are all about sort of big ideas, right? And oftentimes our issues that are value related are informed by those big concepts that we think good or bad, right or wrong. So take a minute now to sort of think about all the things that you think are important, right? The big ideas like love or compassion, loyalty, freedom, justice, caring for one another. Think about all those big ideas. Those big ideas are your values. And so our current discussion about values, right, is really about our beliefs about the way the world ought to be. That's what values are. They're our beliefs about the way the world should be. And sometimes they're completely unconscious, which is why we call them assumptions, right? So we're on slide 5. And so if you state something as true, like, I think that college tuition should be cheaper. What you're really doing is you're stating some assumption about the world. And so what are those assumptions when I say that statement, that college tuition should be free? That statement, I think education is important. So education is a value, clearly I think is important. Equality, equal access is embedded in that statement too. Those are the assumptions that underlie that statement. And people's beliefs about their values, those unstated assumptions, are often sort of the unstated underpinnings of somebody's argument, particularly a value issue, a value argument. Our next discussion, so not right now, but our next discussion is going to be about reality. Right? Not what you think is good or bad, right or wrong, but rather what you think is. Like, not what is the best soda pop in the world, that might be a value, but rather what is the most popular, right? Simply tracking what is the most popular would be a reality assumption, a belief about the way the world actually is. And people actually can have competing reality assumptions as well. But for today, we're going to focus on these things that are good or bad, right or wrong, these values, and how sometimes people can have different value structures, which leads them to ask different questions, or if they're asking the same questions, answer those questions very differently. And so value assumptions, which are beliefs about the way the world ought to be, really inform value issues, right? Those questions about good or bad, right or wrong. And then those value issues then feed into, policy issues. It's all interrelated. So it moves us on to slide 6. And I think it comes as no surprise to anyone watching this video that people sometimes disagree about value issues. For example, is it wrong to have an abortion? Is capital punishment immoral? Does tuition cost too much? Do executives make too much money? All of these are value issues. And people of goodwill, very bright, moral people, will often answer a value issue in very different ways. And so we have to sort of ask the question, why is this, right? And it's sort of a larger question. And so there's sort of competing hypotheses, right? One explanation might be that people just have totally radically different values, totally radically different value structures, right? But I think a much more reasonable explanation, and one backed up by research, is not so much that people have different values. It's actually not what the research suggests. And so I want to talk a little bit about some psychological research that sort of has looked at people's values cross-culturally and really revealed that when you look the world over, people have very different values. And here's how they do it. What they do is, and there's actually a researcher named Jonathan Haidt right there on slide 6, H-A-I-D-T. They pronounce it Haidt. And he's done some cross-cultural research where he's gone to dozens and dozens of different countries and given surveys to hundreds and thousands of people, where he's given them these moral scenarios, where he's asked them, okay, you're about to make a moral decision, about the world. How do you make this decision? And he's asked this question in a bunch of different ways. And what he's discovered is cross-culturally, the world over, people really identify the same values. And they're summarized right there. There appears to be, according to the research, 5 fairly universal moral dimensions. And so let's walk through them one at a time. So the first fairly universal moral dimension is care versus harm, right? Care versus harm. And this is a moral dimension that means most people the world over, when you ask them about good or bad, right or wrong, how do you make your moral decisions, identify the basic idea that we ought to care for one another, maybe not care for everybody, but that caring for people is a good thing. That when people get what they need and when people have good things happen to them, that is generally the moral thing. And to the extent that you can care for others and not hurt them, which is the other side of that coin, don't hurt them, that we care for people and we don't hurt them is a basic moral dimension. And most people identify this as important, that it's a good thing to care for people and a bad thing to hurt them, right? Fairly universal moral dimension. A second fairly universal moral dimension is this idea of justice. Justice. And no matter where you go the world over, people identify this as important. And so what do we mean by justice? And this is the idea that there should be a systematic way of deciding that people should get what they deserve, for lack of a better way of describing it. That when you make good decisions, good things should happen to you. When you make bad decisions, generally speaking, good things should not come to you. That there should be a just system of laws that apply generally the same to everyone. Now, when we say that people value justice, this does not mean that justice is always perfectly applied, right? That's not what these 5 universal moral dimensions mean. What this means is when you ask people how they make decisions, they identify wanting a just outcome where people essentially get what they deserve is something that they identify as an important dimension for them to make their good moral decisions. And of course, people violate their values and morals all the time. But people basically identify justice as and fairness, that people should, that if fairness is an important thing. For example, in most places in the world, if you say, hey, I've got, I'm handing out baskets of food and I have 10 of them and there's 10 of us, I'm going to give 1 bag to each person. And that would be fair. Most people can identify that basic idea. And in fact, do value justice and fairness. A third moral dimension that you find the world over is something called in-group loyalty. That when you ask people about their decision making, they identify the idea that the people that they're connected to, which is something we call an in-group, the people that they're connected to need greater consideration in their decision making than other people they're less connected to. So this might be your family, right? This might be your country. This might be your work group. This might be your romantic partner. This might be your gender, right? It can be any particular group, but the people who your behavior impacts or who you are personally connected to when making a moral decision gets a greater amount of your consideration, and you are loyal to that group in that way. Now, who people are loyal to, of course, shifts and changes based on the culture, but this basic moral dimension is there, this idea of in-group loyalty. A fourth moral dimension is respect for authority. The world over, when people say they make moral decisions, they almost always are talking about some authority that they're going to look to as a guide for their behavior, or some authority that they're going to trust, or that it's important to give deference, to give respect to authority figures. Now, people have different authorities that they trust, of course. Let's just use America, for example, right? If you're a liberal, you certainly you have respect for authority, but who? You're probably going to prioritize liberal politicians as the authority figures who you have more respect for and who you want to give deference to. If you're a Republican, it's probably more conservative politicians that you're going to see as authority figures. Or let's just take religion. People who are very religious almost certainly value their religious authorities. But let's say you're an atheist. Does that mean you don't have any respect for authority? No, it means you may prioritize the authority of science when making moral decisions, right? But the world over, people identify respect for authority and the need to respect authority as an important moral dimension. And the last fairly universal moral dimension that you see pretty much the world over is purity. Now, what does it mean to be pure? Well, that depends on who you ask, right? Let's again use our modern American culture as an example. Democrats or liberals might identify the wanting to have pure food, pure water, a pure environment as an incredibly important moral dimension. Someone who's more religious has at least in modern America, more conservative bent, might identify sexual purity as an incredibly important facet of their moral decision making. Either way, you see this idea of holding something pure and clean coming through as a fairly universal moral dimension. Now, there is arguably a sixth. There's some new research that has come out that suggests that maybe a sixth moral dimension is freedom, this desire of your freedom to act. But when you look historically, this has not always been a universal moral dimension, where these other five tend to be not only cross-culturally consistent, but also historically consistent. So, wrapping us back around, moving on to slide 7. If research is fairly clear that we have these basic 5 moral dimensions that are really consistent, where does conflict get in then, right? Well, the first is that what purity means might differ from person to person, or which groups you should be loyal to differs from person to person. But let's say you have some fairly strong agreement about what it means to be pure, or you're even in fairly strong agreement about which groups you ought to be loyal to, or you're in fairly strong agreements about which authorities you should trust. People of goodwill can still have strong disagreements, right? Strong disagreements about value issues. And so why does this come in? Well, it's this idea of value conflict. In any given situation, there are often several moral dimensions, several values that get into conflict. Not because people have radically different values, because research is clear that people do not, but rather they prioritize their values differently. It's that when you sit down to make a decision, oftentimes you don't consciously prioritize. You're saying this dimension is more important than another, but you unconsciously prioritize your values. You say, in this situation, this value is more important than this other one. And so let's use the example of abortion, because I think it's a really good one. I think a lot of times people who are against abortion characterize people who think it should be legal and permissible as evil, as bad people, as immoral people. And I think the other side does the same thing too. I think people who think that abortion should be legal and permissible will often characterize people who are against that idea that they are just somehow ignorant or immoral themselves. And here's how they characterize each other. That if the other side is somehow morally reprehensible. But think about it. Think about this concept of abortion. If you're trying to decide the policy issue of whether or not abortion should be legally permissible, what really speaks to that is the value issue of whether or not abortion is wrong, right? And I think several values inform this question. It's not a simple issue, right? Certainly, care versus harm comes in, right? Where you're having to, think about the developing organism inside the woman. Whether or not we have an obligation to protect that life. Sort of the sanctity of life is an important value that comes into this question. But also personal autonomy, right? The personal autonomy of the woman and her rights to her body. And I think that people who disagree on this issue often have very similar values, but they prioritize them differently. My point of view on this issue is like this. It's not as if people who are against abortion are like, down with personal autonomy, women should have no say over their bodies. It's not like that at all, right? People who are against abortion, typically speaking, are totally okay with women making lots of decisions about their bodies, lots of personal decisions about their autonomy. It's that they're prioritizing the sort of developing fetus, the sort of caring for that potential life over the personal autonomy of the woman in this situation. And the flip side is true too. People who think abortion should be legally permissible, it's not that they're like down with life sucks, compulsory abortions for everyone. Of course not. It's not that people who think that abortion should be legally permissible don't value human life. They're just prioritizing that value as less important in this situation, the developing life, the potential life, as less important than the personal autonomy of the woman in the situation, or they're prioritizing the woman's health over the developing fetus, right? And so it's not that these two individuals who disagree have radically different values. They almost certainly both value human life. They almost certainly both value adult autonomy over their bodies. It's just in this situation they're prioritizing their values differently, and that's what happens when you end up with people who disagree with each other about value issues. It's not that we have radically different values. It's that we're in value conflict. It's that we are prioritizing our values differently, which then puts them into conflict. And a lot of times, people can have conflict within themselves, and a lot of unstated conflict where you don't examine it carefully. And a good critical thinker will sit down and go, okay, I have this knee-jerk gut-level reaction to this issue. What are all the different values that feed into this question? And explicitly, carefully prioritize their values and say, okay, in this situation, what do I think is more important? Is there another value that informs this question? If I'm answering this value issue this way, like let's say I want to suggest that abortion should not be legally permissible, recognize that all the different values that feed into that question and explicitly prioritize them and say, yes, personal autonomy is relevant to this issue. Yes, the caring for this woman's mental health or caring for this woman's body is important to this issue. But explicitly state, I'm prioritizing the developing fetus over these other considerations. I'm explicitly stating that this value is more important to me. And I think a good critical thinker can do that. And I think when you recognize that two different people are coming to different answers on value issues, and you recognize that the reason that the two people are coming to disagreement is not because they actually have totally different values, but are rather prioritizing their values differently, I think you can agree to disagree and sort of pursue different policies as a result, without characterizing the other side as completely evil. I think it's much easier to do that, and just a better way of going about finding truth. So, moving on to slide 8. I think a really important skill as a critical thinker is being able to recognize all the different values that feed into value issues. That the abortion issue, no matter what, for example, just as an example, it's important to recognize all the different values that feed into it. It's not just about life. It's not just about personal autonomy. It's not just about compassion. It's not just about care versus harm. It's not just about health. All of these big ideas feed into that issue. And you need to consider them all and carefully prioritize each value when you're trying to come to a decision about what you think is good or bad, right or wrong. I think that's a really important skill to have as a good critical thinker. And so let's do another example to make sure we can do this, maybe less of a hot button issue example, right? So let's do the issue of when my roommate asks how she looks in her new outfit, should I tell her that she has hideous taste in clothes, right? It's an issue, right? Now it's a policy issue. Do you notice how it's a policy issue? I'm trying to figure out what I should actually do. Should I tell her she is wearing hideous clothes? Well, I don't know, but it's definitely a policy issue. So I come up with this reason, and I say, well, I think she wants an honest answer from me. I think she deserves an honest answer. So therefore, yes, I'm going to tell her that her dress is ugly and she should not leave the house because she looks terrible. Green spandex, not your thing. But when I provide you with that reason, recognize that there's a value assumption there. There's an assumption that I'm making that informs this question. Obviously, when I say to you, my roommate expects and deserves an honest answer, what do I think is important? Honesty. But now ask yourself this question. Are there other values that I might want to consider when trying to ask and answer this question, this very important policy issue about whether or not I should tell my roommate her clothes are ugly? Probably. How about friendship? How about respect? How about compassion and consideration? Possibly these values inform this question also, right? And so when coming to my decision, I should probably not just go, well, she deserves an honest answer, and so thus I'm just going to tell her what I think. I should probably weigh the different pros and cons of all the different values that inform this question before I decide what to do. Hopefully that makes sense, right? And for yourself, try to come up with different questions and try to identify all the different values that feed into it. Yeah? All right. So now we have this working idea of a value. A value is a big idea. And value assumptions inform value issues, and when you ask and answer a value issue, you're coming up with an answer to the way you think the world ought to be, right? This is different than something we call ethics. Now, ethics is what you do about your values, right? Ethics are really the policy issues that you then ask and answer based on your values. Using our previous example from slide 9 about should I tell my roommate that her clothes are ugly, is really about an ethic, right? Am I always going to be honest in every situation? Would be an example of coming up with a code of ethics. Ethics are about the rules. And since they're about the rules of what you ought to do, how you should actually ought to behave, ethics are all about policy issues, about what am I going to do about my values. So I believe that honesty is important. I've sat down and thought to myself, do I think that honesty is important? Well, honesty is how people know they can trust me. Honesty is how we can figure out what's true in the world. And so, yes, I believe that honesty is important. I've asked and answered a value issue. But now what am I going to do about it? So, yeah, oh, great. I have identified honesty as an important value. And I say, yes, I think honesty is important. Well, now what? What are you going to do? How is your behavior going to be changed? What rules are you going to make for yourself? Because you think honesty is important. Those are your ethics. Values are the big ideas: truth, justice, the American way, compassion. There are 5 fairly universal values: care versus harm, justice and fairness, in-group loyalty, respect for authority and purity. What are you going to do about it? That's where the rubber meets the road. It's your ethics. Your ethics are what are you going to do? So your ethics then inform policy issues. What are you going to do about the things you think are important? And so moving on to slide 11, this is where value prioritization really comes in. I think most of us unconsciously come up with a code of ethics for ourselves. That's what we do. We figure out how we're going to behave based on our value prioritization. We prioritize our values differently. We say, this is my most important value. And because this is my most important value, I'm going to let that guide my ethics. And because different people prioritize their values differently, this leads to different codes of ethics. And this is where people get into disagreements. Is because it's not that our values are radically different. We're just making our list of most important differently. And so we end up with very different codes of ethics. And you can see how that can happen. Let me give you some examples then in slide 12 of some pretty common codes of ethics. And essentially, this is somebody else. This is basically just examples of people choosing a particular value and prioritizing it over all others. First, so there's the idea of libertarianism. Libertarianism is the belief that individual liberty, an individual person's right to autonomy, to make decisions for themselves, needs to sort of preempt all other values. And here's an example of a thought experiment to know whether or not you might be a libertarian. So let's say 10 people crash on a desert island, and in order for any of them to survive, all 10 people have to pool their resources and cooperate. Otherwise, the likelihood of anyone's survival is low. A libertarian would say each of the 10 people has an individual right to decide whether or not to pool their resources to maximize survival. And if one person wants to take his bag of goodies and go to the other side of the island, that person should be allowed to do so. And even if that means all 10 people have a will be much less likely to survive, right? And I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm not suggesting to you it's good or bad, right or wrong. I'm just suggesting that would be an example of putting liberty above all other values and saying, nope, I'm going to prioritize individual human liberty, even if that comes at a cost, even though that makes it so some people are going to be worse off, or even if all of us will be worse off. Another example of a code of ethics that is guided by identifying a single value as the most important would be something called utilitarianism. And this is the basic idea that we need to maximize the good in the world, that we need to make decisions, basically come up with a code of ethics that ensures the maximum number of people are happy and the fewest number of people are in pain. There's actually a fable written by an author named Ursula K. Le Guin that sort of speaks to this. And in this fable, she suggests that there is this shining city on a hill. And in this shining city on the hill, everyone is super prosperous, super happy, and no one ever suffers. It's just wonderful there. The city is called Omelas, and the name of the short story is The People Who Walk Away from Omelas. So Ursula K. Le Guin, Leguin, sort of gives us this, for instance, this example. She says, the most amazing place in the universe. Everyone is happy. Everyone is prosperous. Everything is wonderful. But then the punchline is that all of this comes at a cost. And what she suggests is that everyone in the city gets to be happy because of the misery of a single child living in darkness. Now, from a utilitarian standpoint, 99.99999% of the people are ridiculously, stupidly happy, and one child has to live in misery. To a utilitarian, I don't know, you're prioritizing maximizing the benefit for all, and almost everyone is happy. Are you okay with this situation? And Ursula K. Le Guin doesn't have any answers for you. She's just asking you the question. And the last sort of line of the story, she says, and although everyone is happy, every day more people walk away from Omelas, from this city on the hill, this shining city, because it's tough, right? And again, utilitarian, the idea that you should maximize human happiness, not a bad thing. Should you prioritize that value over all others? Well, if you would, think about the logical end of that reasoning. The last one I want to go over is just religious values, right? Many people prioritize their own particular religion above other considerations, and they and again, I'm not suggesting that's good or bad, right or wrong. I'm just suggesting that that many people do this. They say, yes, I value care versus harm. Yes, I value in-group loyalty. I value all of these things, but my religion says this, and so I'm going to do this because I prioritize the rules of my religion over other considerations. And this would be examples of codes of ethics. Now, I think a good critical thinker doesn't choose one value as the most important. I just think someone who really can sit down and try to figure out what's true, even about something as subjective as values, recognizes all of the different big ideas that should feed into their question. So I think a good critical thinker doesn't say liberty is the most important, doesn't say utilitarianism is the most important, doesn't say equality is the most important, but rather recognizes that they're all important. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to talk about egalitarianism. Egalitarianism is this idea that we need to prioritize equity above basically equality above all others. And I have a short story recommendation for this one too, and it's actually by Kurt Vonnegut, who wrote Slaughterhouse Five. V. Vonnegut, V-O-N-N Von E V-O-N-N-E-G-E-T. Kurt Vonnegut. If you Google it, Google will spell it correctly. I apologize. In any case, he wrote this short story called Harrison Bergeron. And in this story, society has decided that they are going to make everyone equal. Everyone's going to have the same house. Everyone's going to have the same income. Everyone's going to be equal. But then they take it a step further, and they say everyone has to have the same attractiveness. So anyone more beautiful than anyone else has to wear a mask. Everyone has to have the same intellect. So anyone who's smarter than anyone else has to have a chip implanted in their brain that disrupts their thoughts. So everyone has average intelligence. Everyone has to have the same physical fitness as other people. So if you happen to be a more physically adept person, you have to walk around with sandbags, right? And so Kurt Vonnegut is taking this idea that we all have to be equal all the time to its logical conclusion. That if you value equality over all other considerations, like maybe human diversity and valuing diversity, you end up with some pretty silly decisions. And both of these short stories are fables, which again I sort of speaks to my point, which is that a good critical thinker doesn't identify one value as the be all end all of all decision making, but identifies all of the values that should inform their code of ethics. Moving on to slide 13. So now we get into a slightly different topic. And this is going to be the difference between really making ethics based on ideal values versus real values. And this is the idea that we all have these really big, important ideas that we think are super, that we hold dear to our hearts, like truth or justice or life. But when you're coming up with a code of ethics, you have to ask the question, can our values only be applied in a perfect world? Those would be our ideal values. So am I holding on to a value so tightly in an ideal way that I could never actually put it into practice? That would be an ideal value. This is different than something called a real value on slide 14. This is the idea that when you're coming up with a code of ethics, you have to decide how your values can actually function in the real world. Not only in theory, but also in practice. And I think American criminal justice is a great example of this. So in theory, we have justice, right? Right? We have justice, where in a theoretical sense, in a perfect sense, in an ideal sense, only guilty people should go to jail, right? Only guilty people should ever go to jail, and innocent people should always go free. That would be the ideal. That would be our ability to put our value into practice in an ideal world, in a perfect world. But can we make ethics based on that? Can we come up with a code of conduct that basically applies that ideal value of only guilty people are going to go to jail and only innocent people go free? Can we do that? No, we can't. So when we sit down and make up a code of rules for ourselves, a code of ethics, we need to say, okay, what can I actually put into practice? Can I put perfect justice into practice? I can't. I can't put perfect justice into practice. I can't ensure that everyone will always get what they deserve in terms of criminal justice. I can't. But what can I do? Maybe I can ensure due process. Now, what is due process? Well, it's a legal term that means in our country, the rules are supposed to apply to everyone equally. Everyone has a right to a lawyer. Everyone has a right to a trial by jury. Everyone has a right to to do what's called due process. The same rules are supposed to apply to everyone in the same way. Now, this is something we can work towards. This is something that we could theoretically try to put into practice, right? Now, do we do a good job of that in America? Well, that's a different question altogether. But at least we can get closer, right? Our criminal justice system tries to make sure we have due process, meaning the rules apply equally to everyone. Everyone is going to get their trial by jury. Everyone is going to get their access to their lawyer. No one is going to be able to be tried twice for the same crime. And so we try our best to ensure due process. And sometimes we fail miserably. And that's a separate question. But this is the distinction between we can try to ensure the real value of due process, which is an application of justice. We can't even get anywhere near remotely close to the ideal value of perfect justice. Only guilty people go to jail, innocent people always go free. And that's the distinction. You can work towards the real value of due process. You can't work towards the ideal value of perfect justice. And so let's do a little activity together. So slide 15, I have the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pause the video, and I'd like you to take a look at this slide that says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And so I want you to pause the video and take a look at this. And I want you to see if you can identify all the big ideas, all the values that are in this first statement of our U.S. Declaration of Independence. What did our founding fathers, and yes, founding fathers because they were all men, what are you going to do? Different time. What did they think were important, right? What were the big things? Because they didn't just identify one thing, right? When in this one statement, they identified several big ideas that were informing the creation of this country. So pause the video and take a look at this. Now that we're back, hopefully you've done that. So here's all the values that I would identify in reading this. Well, truth, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. So obviously they value truth, right? Are created. Oh, well, I get created equal. So I guess equality was something that was important to them. They were endowed by their Creator. Ooh, apparently the idea of a creator is something that they value. This idea of religion and respect for religion was something that they thought was important because they put it right in there in this U.S. Declaration of Independence, the idea of a creator. And then also unalienable rights is a big value. And what unalienable rights were to our founding fathers was this idea that there are some rights that you can't take away. There are some things that the government should not have the ability to take away from you. And so that big idea was right there in this very first sentence, that there were some rights that you could not alienate from someone. And that's how they came up with the Bill of Rights, the things that you could not take away. And what did they identify? What did they identify as rights that you should not be able to take away from people, that you should not be able to just rip away from people? Life. Clearly they valued life. Liberty, the ability to decide for oneself. And the pursuit of happiness. Not happiness itself, but that people should be free to pursue what makes them happy. And so in one sentence, we have our founding fathers identifying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different values in one sentence that helped shape and guide their decision-making about the creation of this country, right? And so we need to do the same. When coming up with our code of ethics, we should come up with all of the different values that should inform our decision-making. And so moving on to slide 16. How do we apply ethics to this class? All right. So in applying ethics to this class, there are some things that I'm going to ask you to do in order for us to all engage in ethical argumentation. I would like us to come up with a code of ethics based on the things that we value in this class, which is truth, mutual respect, openness to new ideas. All these values are important. So what ethics can I come up with that allow me to engage in argumentation in an ethical way? The first is to be honest, right? To be honest, we have to be honest about our reasons. We have to be honest in our conclusions. That if we come up with an argument, if we gather evidence, to be very clear and honest about the things that you actually believe. Believe it or not, not everyone does this. Now, some people hide what they really believe. They hide their conclusions because maybe they think other people are going to disagree with them. And so they actually do believe things. They come up with some conclusions about the world, but they're not honest about them. Don't do that. If we're going to figure out what's true in this class, and we're going to be sharing ideas, be honest about what you believe. Our first ethic. Second thing. When we're coming up with our reasons, when we're gathering evidence and sharing evidence with one another, do not omit or distort. That means don't leave things out. If you go out on a fact-finding mission and you start gathering evidence and you, find some evidence that maybe doesn't actually support your point of view, it's not honest to leave it out. You need to tell us, share that evidence with us, and share that evidence with yourself, and don't distort it, which means don't change it. That's not going to help us figure out what's true. Third rule. I'm going to make some claims in here. For example, today I made some claims about the universal moral dimensions. I said there were 5 of them, but I told you where that research came from. I told you it was from a gentleman named Jonathan Haidt. So you can go then do some research for yourself. And so don't just do it with my claims, but do it with every kind of piece of evidence that you gather. And I think this is especially important in today's day and age where we have the internet. And it's just so easy to Google a topic or different memes, M-E-M-E, go through our social media feeds. And if somebody says something is true and it resonates with us, we just want to believe it without actually researching it for ourselves. When you're trying to figure out what's true as a good critical thinker, when you want to come up with good arguments, don't just accept the facts as they're presented to you. Go do the research for yourself. Investigate the claims that are made. And it never fails. Weekly, I see something come through my social media feed, which I know to be complete BS. Sometimes it happens to agree with my point of view. Let's say there's something that comes through my feed that attacks a particular politician that I don't like. Now, I might want to believe this terrible thing about this politician, but it's dishonest for me, and it's not going to help me figure out what's true to not thoroughly research the statement that has been made. Research it for yourself, right? That is just a ground rule as being a critical thinker. Fourth thing, we have to listen respectfully to each other because sometimes other people who oppose us, who happen to agree with us, have good information. And we have to be able to listen to counter points of view. We have to be able to listen to evidence that disagrees with our preconceived notions about the world. If we're going to figure out what's true, we have to listen and gather evidence that contradicts us. And maybe we gather the evidence that contradicts us, we thoroughly research the claims made in those contradictory points of view and go, nope, I've listened respectfully to your point of view, I've gathered all the evidence about your point of view, I've researched what you've had to say, and I can refute it. I can say, no, what you've said about X, Y, and Z just simply isn't true. I disagree with your point of view because I've thoroughly researched everything that you've had to say, and I've listened respectfully to your point of view, and now I can ethically argue against it. But then another rule, another sort of ethics of argumentation, of good argumentation, is to be willing to change your mind. If you listen to someone else's point of view, if you're respectfully letting them give you counter evidence, and that evidence that you then thoroughly research for yourself is compelling, be willing to revise your point of view. Be willing to say to yourself, you know, I listened to your point of view and I listened to the evidence that you gave me. I went and researched the evidence that you provided, and it turns out you had some pretty good evidence. So I'm going to revise my position. That's what a good critical thinker does. The last rule in ethical argumentation is to credit your sources. Cite your sources. Cite your references. Why do we have to do this? And a lot of students will say, well, because you want to give credit where credit is due. You don't plagiarize because you don't want people to think you're smarter than you are, right? And I think a lot of times when professors say, hey, don't plagiarize, make sure to credit your secondary sources, make sure to cite your sources, we think it's because we don't want to be a cheater. And that's part of it. But in critical thinking, and really in academia, in the sciences, and in scholarship, the reason we cite our sources is to not just be a cheater, not just not be a plagiarizer. It's actually more important than that. There's another reason. Because you see number 3 there, thoroughly research the claims that have been made. You can't do that. You can't thoroughly research the claims that have been made unless somebody else cites their sources. And so when you are making an argument, you have to be respectful of your audience by telling them where you got your information so they can engage in ethical argumentation. That's actually why we cite our sources. It's not so we're not cheaters. That's important too. Right? Don't plagiarize. That's important too. But it's more important that we let people research the claims that we make. That's why we cite our sources. And I think that doesn't get, I don't think that gets discussed enough in classes. We tell students not to cheat. We tell students not to plagiarize, but we often don't tell them why. The more important reason why we cite our sources is so that other people can check up on our claims. So when I tell you that Jonathan Haidt says that there's 5 universal moral dimensions, you can go check up on me. You can go, did he really say that? And you can go thoroughly research the claims that I've made. That is actually why we cite our sources. And I think we don't really give that enough attention in a lot of classes about why students need to cite their sources. All right. So last sort of topic for ethics in action is how we know we're being ethical, right? How we know we're being ethical. And your book actually talks about this a lot. And it basically says there are 4 sort of questions to ask yourselves to ensure that you're being an ethical person. And there's 4 questions, and they're 4 tests. And what the book suggests you do, and I'm now suggesting that you do, is that when you're making an ethical decision, when you're faced with an ethical or moral dilemma, a value-based dilemma, ask yourself these questions. Really do these 4 tests for yourself. And the first is called the role exchange test. And this is where, when you're coming up with a decision, switch the roles of the people involved. And ask yourself, would I still make this decision if the roles were reversed? Here's an example of this. So let's say I suggest to my partner, hey, I want to split up the housework for tonight. I'm going to go ahead and vacuum and do the dishes, and why don't you mow the lawn and take out the trash? And my partner says to me, oh, okay, except I would prefer it if we switch. You mow the lawn and take out the trash, and I'll vacuum and do the dishes. If it still feels fair to me after I've switched the roles, then you're probably making an ethical decision. Second thing is called the universal consequences test. And this is where you say, let's take this to the logical conclusion. What would happen if I made this decision over and 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 over again? It's called the universal consequences test. And there's actually a principle in psychology called the tragedy of the commons. It's this idea that when somebody makes a decision, oftentimes they say to themselves, well, it's not a big deal that I'm doing this. For example, littering. It's not a big deal if I litter. It's just one piece of paper. But what happens when everybody does it? Everybody starts littering. That is the question behind the universal consequences test. What happens if you make this decision, if you choose to litter, it keeps happening? The universe of consequences, if everyone makes this decision, does it still feel like an ethical decision? If it does, then you're probably okay. The third test that you can do for yourself is called the new cases test, right? And this is where it asks you to make your decision harder. No, I have an ethic as a professor. One of my ethical things is that I don't accept late work. I don't accept late work from anyone, ever. Now, the new cases test would suggest to me, oh yeah, what if your favorite student wants to turn in late work? Would you do it now? If I wouldn't, then I guess I'm being ethical in my equal application of my rule. I know I don't accept late work from anyone, no matter what. But if I start saying, well, maybe for my favorite student, well, maybe I'm not applying my ethics in a truly value-driven way. So new cases test. Another example, I'm a judge and I'm about to hand down a sentence. I might ask myself this question. Would I hand down this sentence if it was my child? See how I'm making this harder for myself? That's the new cases test. And the last test, called the higher principles test, asks you, what is your most important value in this situation? What have you in fact prioritized your values? If you have, and you can say, yes, I've considered all the values, I've identified this principle as the most important one, and when I make this decision, my highest value is being preserved. If we go back to that example from several minutes ago about my friend wants to know how she looks. And I say, well, she deserves an honest answer, and so I tell her clothes are ugly. The higher principles test would require me to go, all right, what's another value that informs this question? And is telling her clothes are ugly really the most ethical thing you can do when you recognize that maybe another value is more important here, like friendship and compassion? That's the higher principles test. And so the last thing we're going to discuss for today is ethics in action. Essentially, what not to do. These are excuses people make to themselves in order to engage in unethical behavior that doesn't actually apply their values. Essentially, these are called rationalizations. These are mental backflips that people engage in so they don't actually have to engage in ethical behavior. And here they are. The first is called, if it's necessary, it's ethical. It's called the false necessity trap. And there's this movie that I love called The Devil Wears Prada. And in it, the main character is constantly saying, she's engaging in a whole bunch of bad behavior. She's mean to her boyfriend. She doesn't show up to his birthday. She's mean to her friends. She's constantly engaging in this really bad behavior throughout the whole movie. And every time someone calls her on it, she goes, well, I have to do it. It's necessary. I have to do it. And really, there's nothing in the world you have to do but keep breathing, right? You have to keep breathing in and out. You have to eat food. Everything else is a choice. And so to suggest that you have to do something is just mentally lazy. To suggest that something is needed, well, maybe, maybe not. She didn't have to keep engaging in bad behavior. She chose to. And then she fell into this rationalization of, I have to do it. She doesn't have to do it. Second rationalization is to use the law as an excuse. And there's two ways that people do this. They say, well, it's not against the law, so it's totally ethical. Well, there are lots of things that are not against the law that are totally wrong. For example, it is not against the law to cheat on your romantic partner. It is not against the law to lie to your friends. But I would never say it is ethical to cheat on your romantic partner. It is ethical to lie to your friends. Nope. Just because it's legal doesn't make it okay. But a lot of times people say, hey, there's no law against it, so it's totally fine, totally moral. Nope. There's a flip side to that too. Oftentimes in societies, we stumble into completely unjust laws. We're allowed to do things that are immoral. In fact, sometimes the laws require us to do things that are immoral. For example, in this country, slavery was totally legally permissible. And police officers were required to capture people to put them back into bondage. There were laws on the books that were unethical. Maybe you argue there are some laws on the book nowadays that are also unethical. Legality and ethics, although are clearly related, there are plenty of things we have against the law because they're unethical, are not substitutable for one another. Third rationalization. Oh, I was doing it for you, for example. So let's say I'm a mother. I actually happen to be a mother. And let's say I'm a mother of a teenager, and I decide to go into my child's room and clean up his room. And I happen to stumble upon, what's in the drawers? Oh, what's over here? Right? I'm rationalizing my bad behavior by suggesting that I'm doing this behavior for you. And in reality, I'm just doing it for myself. Fourth rationalization, fighting fire with fire. More bad behavior does not excuse bad behavior, right? If someone lies to me, it doesn't make it okay for me to lie back to them, right? You have to decide what your ethics are independent of other people. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and just share my opinion with you about an aspect of modern American politics. I think a lot of times we say, these people of other cultures are bad people. They're torturing people. They're doing horrible things. And so we have to do the same thing in return. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's not what a good critical thinker does. That's not what a person who comes up with a value-driven code of ethics does. A person who believes it's wrong to torture always believes it's wrong to torture, no matter what. I'm going to just go out on a limb and share my opinion with you. If someone else engages in bad behavior, it doesn't make it ethical to engage in that bad behavior also. Not if they really are your ethics driven by your values. A fifth ethics in action. A common excuse for people to say, well, it doesn't hurt what I'm doing doesn't hurt anyone, right? Like I'm littering. It doesn't hurt anyone, so it's totally okay. And not to mention, everybody litters. Well, yeah, but just because you're not technically hurting one right here, right now, by throwing your piece of paper on the ground, and just because everyone litters sometimes, or at least you say they do, doesn't make it ethical. Because think about it. If everyone would litter, and everyone litters all the time, then we're going to be living in squalor. It's just an excuse. To say that no one is technically getting hurt right here, right now, is mentally lazy. You have to think about the fact that, well, if everyone litters, you actually are hurting people. Cumulatively and collectively, you're doing harm to the environment and doing harm to just, who wants to walk around and watch garbage everywhere, as an example of this rationalization. Another one is, if I don't gain personally, it's okay. I think this happens a lot in the workplace as an excuse for bad behavior. Like, let's say you're working in a sales department and you decide to fudge your numbers so it looks like your sales department is doing better than it is. And you say, well, I'm not getting any more money because I make my sales figures look good. I'm not gaining personally, and so it's totally okay for me to do this. Well, yeah, but that's just an excuse because you probably do gain something by doing it. Probably respect or prestige for your work group, or you're going to make your boss look better, which is going to make your boss like you more. And so really suggesting that engaging in bad behavior because you personally are not gaining from it is usually just an excuse. And it doesn't excuse the bad behavior. A next one. I have it coming to me. I think this one is also an excuse that's used in the workplace. For example, if let's say you don't feel you get paid enough, so you decide to steal from your company. Well, that doesn't make stealing ethical, right? That's just an excuse you're making to yourself. And the last one is the excuse of, I can still be objective. Can you now? You can still be objective. So a great example of this excuse would be like, let's use the example of a judge. There's a reason why judges are not allowed to try cases for their own children, because they can't be objective. But a lot of times people will say, well, I'm trying to make a decision about, let's say, who to hire. And my friend comes in and I say, oh, no, I can definitely be on the hiring panel for my friend because I can totally be objective, I promise. Yeah, probably you can't, right? And so it would probably be unethical for you to be on the hiring committee for your friend. You can't make an objective decision. Just like a judge can't sit in judgment of his or her child in a court of law. You can't be objective. So it's going to be unethical for you to make decisions. And these are just examples of how people fall into these cognitive traps where they convince themselves that engaging in unethical behavior is really ethical. And so that sort of completes our topics for today. I want to encourage you to just pay some attention to a discussion that is in your book called Toulmin's Model. It's not going to be on our exam, but I think it's a kind of an interesting way of thinking about the reasons behind our reasons. We'll return to it we'll return to it after our first exam, this idea of the reasons behind our reasons. It's essentially this guy named Toulmin asks you to push back against your reasons. He asked you to sort of question the underlying assumptions behind your reasons. And we'll return to it at a later date. But just pay attention to this section of your book now. And next time, we'll be talking about reality assumptions, and we'll be talking about deductive reasoning. So again, thank you for watching our discussion of values and ethics. We will return, same bat time, same bat channel, next time.